Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. This week I'm speaking to Alyson Mowat, who runs a botanical studio in London and is author of the book Terrariums and Kokedama. I read Alyson's book about a year and a half ago and I've been very keen to speak to her ever since, as I love her way of playing with plants and presenting them as art pieces. I spoke to Alyson about the ethos behind her work, about her botanical creations and what inspires her creativity. She starts by talking about what she gets up to in her studio.
My design studio is in Shoreditch, in the heart of the bustle of Brick Lane. It's around the corner from Columbia Road Flower Market, and it's also quite close to where Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward discovered the terrarium in the 1820s on World Close Square, which is also sort of my neck of the woods. So it's quite nice sort of being in this sort of the hustle and bustle of the urban city environment, and also to have all these kind of these sort of natural points of interest close by. And I've been in my studio since 2014. I started mainly making terrariums using the Tiffany or the copper foil method. However, as the years have progressed, my work's kind of changed a little bit. My creative work has started to include more sort of botanical sculpture and photography. I started to do more writing, and a big part of my work now is workshops. So teaching people how to plant terrariums, kokedamas, indoor aquatic systems, even sort of balcony gardening as well. So that's been a part that I've really enjoyed, because I think working creatively can be a bit of a solitary task at times. So my workshops really are a wonderful point in which to engage with people over plants and planting and the issues that sort of come up in their sort of as they are planting or kind of creating these plantscapes and sort of urban environments. So yeah, that sort of covers what I do have been doing over the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very appropriate that you're near the home of Mr. Ward.
I know, fabulous Mr. Ward. Yeah.
Yeah.
Changed things so much for us all.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, very much so. It was interesting what you said then about kind of getting hands-on with people, because your book that I read about a year ago now, and I loved it, and I thought I must speak to Alyson because she's fascinating. But in your book, you do make things very kind of straightforward, very uncomplicated, but there really isn't a substitute for being hands-on and actually watching someone do it, is there? I mean, it is important, I think, to touch base if you're having any problems. It just gives you that reassurance.
So. Yeah, I think so. And things come up so much as you're sort of in the planting process that maybe doesn't come across as well, sort of just reading through things in a book. So there is that element as well, which is interesting, definitely, for both me and for my students as well.
Yeah, definitely. So when I read your book, and also when I looked on your website, I thought to myself, you're really elevating plants to works of art. And then when I read a bit more about on your website, I noticed that that's how you describe your work too. So what's the process involved? What does it involve for you? Obviously it's going beyond placing a plant in a pot. You're taking it to the next level. So it becomes a conversation starter or maybe the focal point of a space. How does that kind of evolve from literally plonking something in a pot to what you're doing?
Yeah, I think the aim for me is always to elevate plants, as you say, to works of art, or think about things in compositions, as far as composition goes, or placing plants. Trying to think of things as creatively as possible, and by planting plants under glass or suspending them in interesting ways. We are framing them as, I guess, we do the artwork in our homes and elevating them in their own right. I think as well, by keeping a close eye on nature, you realise how it mirrors our own lives, with the growth and loss of every passing season or chapter. So it's something that kind of, I don't know, they're kind of beautiful to have around you in your home and to watch them as they change, as you change. I find the process of shooting for still life or arranging terrariums for displays feels quite similar to me, and it feels to part of the same creative process. So I try and think about things whenever I'm doing anything or working with plants in any way, really, even if it is just planting them in a pot, to try to kind of think about display and what plants will work best together. So yeah, always trying to think of things as creatively as possible, and aesthetically as pleasing, as aesthetically pleasing as possible.
Yeah, definitely.
That was a mouthful.
Yeah, but that actually brings me on to the next question, which was about containers. And when I've been playing around with plants, I do sometimes find it difficult to source nice containers. So, where do you source your stuff from? And are you of the mindset that you can pretty much use anything? You just have to be a bit creative and a bit practical about it?
Yeah, I think when I started out, there wasn't a huge amount of choice. Now there's so much choice as far as terrariums and containers go, but that really sort of got me starting to make my own. So I learned the copper foil technique so that I could create these quite geometric shapes that would enclose sort of quite a large sort of planting scheme. And I've also in the past became really interested in working with concrete, and kind of the planters that I wanted to create had very sort of faceted shapes. And so I just started making molds and creating my own pots in the shapes that I wanted. So you can kind of create shapes from scratch or pots from scratch, but at the same time you can use absolutely anything, just as long as you can drill holes to kind of create a makeshift pot so that there's plenty of drainage. If you want to create a terrarium, just make sure you enclose that open space or that glass space so that humidity can build up and you can create the sort of condensation needed for a closed terrarium. Anything can really, even with sort of epiphytes, kind of orchids, just make sure their roots are exposed, but you can mount them on anything really. So I guess it's a case of just being as creative as you possibly can.
Yeah. If you pick the right place, the chances are, if you pick the right plant, the chances are it's going to be a permanent fixture in your home, and it's going to be very much part of the family. So it is worth just taking the time to think about how you're framing it and what you're putting it in, because you're probably going to be looking at it for quite a long time, and it's worth that investment, isn't it?
Absolutely. With any luck, you'll be looking at it for a long time.
Depends what you pick, I think, sometimes.
Exactly.
So bearing in mind the fact that you do think about plants as works of art, are you just using plants as your inspiration, or are you drawing inspiration from other sources when you're working with plants?
Well, I come from a sort of design jewelry kind of background, so I was very kind of inspired initially by faceted shapes and gemstones and incorporating crystals when working with plants. But I think for me the big inspiration over time has been Japan. They approach nature with such awe and reverence, and I think that's why they kind of have such interesting they work with plants and flowers as well, kokedama, in such interesting, unique ways. And there's also there's that very sort of traditional ancient art of working with plants and flowers, but then there's also sort of more modern pioneers such as Azumu Makoto, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who really pioneered the genre of botanical sculpture, with his Exo Biotanica project. He launched a bonsai tree into space and photographed it. He also has kind of placed flowers in massive ice cubes. His frozen, this iced flower series. So I think Japan has always been quite inspiring. I love the work of Georgia O'Keeffe and Carl Blossfeld's art forms in nature. Examples from the plant world are really beautiful as well. So yes, kind of looking at art and kind of connecting that maybe with what I'm doing with plants or photography or sculpture. Kind of, I like to kind of draw on these things, or these people.
So speaking of Japan, you create kokedama, and you talk about that as well in your book. And I was talking to somebody about that today, and she said to me, "I'd love to have a go, but I wouldn't know where to start. It looks very difficult." Can you just explain a little bit about what it is, and maybe if someone was thinking of having a go, what might be an easy plant to use?
Sure. So kokedama translates as mothballs, and what we're doing when we're creating kokedama is really encasing the plant's roots in a sphere of soil and then binding it with moss. And by doing this, we can suspend the plant from different angles, have it hanging upside down, it doesn't necessarily even need to be hanging. Actually, in Japan, I find kokedamas are usually displayed next to bonsai. So when bonsai are displayed, you often see quite a very sort of a lot more naturalistic looking kokedama sitting next to the bonsai, a very sort of natural, almost meadow-like planting, sort of on the kokedama. However, it was kind of been adapted a little bit in the Netherlands, and that's when we start to see them being hung more, and the mossy sphere kind of becomes a little bit more spherical and kind of rounded, whereas in Japan it's a little looser. And what we're really, I think, if anyone's approaching or wanting to try a kokedama on their own, don't be put off by the special clay soil that you need to use when making akadama soil. It's quite hard to source and it's quite pricey as well. I find a low dust cat litter works just as well. Just use regular sort of potting soil, something with minimal peat in it if possible, and then you're sort of just creating your sphere from that, kind of getting a nice sort of sticky consistency, almost like a consistency of chocolate brownie mixture, and then encasing the roots or placing the roots sort of within that mixture and then binding with moss. And then you can decide if you want to hang it or rest it on a tray. So philodendrons are really good. I always use asparagus ferns for my workshops. Mainly because I love the look of them, and I think the kind of layers or the tiers of the foliage of an asparagus fern, for me, it kind of has definite connections with Japan and the sort of bonsai trees. So that's one of the reasons I like to use asparagus fern. That they do work particularly well in kokedama as well. Mm-hmm. Something to try.
Yeah, I did dabble with it, and I found anything with a kind of clear stem made for much easier life, because anything that had lots of growth down at the base, it was difficult to kind of pinch it in and make that secure connection almost around the neck of it. So, yeah.
I know what you mean, yes.
Yeah.
Another thing, plants that kind of creep and drape, like ivy, works particularly well. And ivy is a lovely one to use in kokedama because it's air purifying qualities. So I quite like to have hanging ivy sort of in my home, kind of nestled within this sort of the roots nestled within this kokedama sphere and hanging. I think it works quite nicely.
Yeah, I love ivy. I can't get enough of ivy myself. But I was wondering, can you make them that actually live outdoors? Because obviously a lot of your work, I think, is you work a lot in urban gardens, and maybe people might want to go vertically if they don't have a lot of space outdoors. Can you make them using outdoor plants? Does that work?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I mean, I usually take my kokedamas outside in the summer months, and it's even better if Mother Nature can lend a hand with the watering. I find I usually use more sort of tropical plants for my kokedamas, so you bring them indoors, sort of in the colder months, but they thrive outdoors in the summer.
Yeah, I've just stuck my bonds outdoors because I can't face water in it practically on a daily basis. So I chucked it outside and it rained and it was much easier.
Oh, lovely. It's always good when that happens.
Yeah, it was very good. So I noticed also that you create aquatic gardens and what you call jarrariums. And to be honest, I am terrified of that. The most I've managed is a Marimo ball in a jar.
Oh, well, that's a really good start.
Yeah, it's easy. I haven't killed it yet. But what would be your top tip for people who want to dip a toe or a plant into the water?
I'd really recommend that they read Diana Wolsted's book, Ecology of the Planted Aquarium, where she tries to kind of create the most naturalistic system. And the idea is that you do your planting on a bed of soil so that you don't need to worry about injecting CO2 or any additional nutrients into the water or the environment, the aquatic environment. So it's good to have a little read of that if you are thinking about taking your aquatic garden to the next level, really. But I would really encourage anyone to try an aquatic garden, because there is something about the very hypnotic movement of plants underwater that is rather lovely to have in your home. And you just need to be a little bit wary of algae blooms, so no direct sunlight, trying to keep it a little bit sort of set back in the room, I would advise. But yes, definitely to give it a go. And the Marimo balls are a lovely start as well.
Yeah, they are definitely the beginner's plant of choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw in your book about washing the soil, which seems absolutely bizarre, really, for anyone who does gardening. But it is
the idea is just to get rid of the sediment that kind of will inevitably arise into the water. So it's a good idea to try and get rid of any of that, floating sediment prior to creating an aquatic garden, because you're just going to need to drain out so much of the water in order to get a clear water, so you can actually see what's happening in the plants, and the water isn't clouding your vision of the plants too much.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I haven't heard of the Diana Wolsted book, but I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, with any gardening, but particularly indoor gardening, in as much as you really need to think about what the plant would have in its natural habitat. And that's, I think, probably a key to success with most things.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
If people are gardening in a small space, either indoors or out, can you maybe give kind of one or two key pieces of advice that would help people achieve a visually interesting and probably a personalised garden? As you were saying, the plants are going to be with you, and you can express yourself through the medium of the plants. So is there anything that you think would kind of create success if you were going for a really chic look or really a curated look, really?
I think in both indoor and outdoor planting, it's kind of building up layers and height within your planting. So I find quite often with indoor planting, it's always just sort of shelf level or table level, the planting. And that's why kokedama is such a lovely way of kind of adding height to your planting arrangements and sort of really building up different layers within your arrangement. So I would say kind of exploring that element from the indoor side of things. And with the outdoor spaces, it's mainly sort of small gardens that I work with, or outdoor spaces. And I think the main thing with small gardens, and I've actually just done the thing I'm advising against, I've actually just done this in my own. I've just moved down to Margate. I spend my time between Margate and London. And I've got a tiny little sliver of the garden in Margate. And I've just got so many ideas for this space. I want a fire pit. I want seating so that I can entertain people outside for dinner. I want to have some sort of a water feature. I want to have, I'm trying to just cram as much into this tiny space as possible. And I think it's all about, again, with the indoor and outdoor planting, it's all about how you're going to use the space and trying to consider that before you try and just cram everything into the space. And then, also what it will do is take away space from what you actually want to do most in the garden. So I've had to reevaluate my initial garden plans and kind of reduce things down a little bit to just a nice space where I can have a cocktail outside or a cup of coffee in the morning with a couple of friends. That would be fine. So yeah, I would say that. And again, the layers, sort of thinking about layers and within the outdoor space as well. I'd say pots, I've noticed quite often that it's quite easy to cram a space with lots of little pots. So I've tried to invest more in larger pots and kind of instead of having lots of little itsy-bitsy pots everywhere where everything kind of looks quite split and nothing seems to work as a sort of overall look of the space.
Yeah, I mean, little gardens are the hardest because, especially if you love plants, because you can't help yourself. You go somewhere and you think, oh, I'm going to get that, and then you realise, like you say, that it's a small plant in a small pot, and you stick it in, and before you know it, you've got this jumble. When actually restraint is the key in a small space. Really. But it's incredibly hard to actually do that. I mean, I am hopeless. I'm all right in other people's gardens, but in mine, it's just an absolute jumble. I've chucked everything in because I've got no self-control in my garden. So,
yes.
I
know.
It's
a hard thing to have, though. It's a hard thing to have.
It is.
And I think as well, when you're thinking of parts and colours, maybe to just pick a couple of key colours or a theme and try and stick to that theme so that it runs throughout any decisions you're making in the future. So if that's, say, buying plants or pots or any sort of visual kind of aid in the garden, then I think that it's always good to sort of think back to what your initial aim or intention was visually, and also as far as usage of the space goes.
Yeah. I mean, that's why people need you, really, because you come in at it from, quite dispassionately, really, and you can see what people want to use the space for, and you can see a theme that runs through it, and you will likely have a much kind of stricter hold on what goes into it. So, and sometimes people can't see the wood for the trees in their own spaces. So yes, I think that's why the job that you're doing, especially in smaller spaces, is invaluable, really. So well done.
Oh, thank you. I also like people, though, to take control of their own spaces. So I do offer classes as well, and kind of just teach people quite basic bits and pieces, even for just there's a bit of sort of software that's really easy to use called SketchUp, and it's amazing how quickly you can lay out a small space and really understand the scale and the perspective of things with just having very sort of quite basic computer knowledge. And I think that it's quite nice to kind of give people the control over the space as well, and to understand, how they can really use that space, and realizing themselves that they're not going to fit a table to seat 8 in that space. They might have to rein that in a little bit. and also putting mood boards together is a really fun thing that I like to do with in my workshop as well. So trying to work out why you like certain elements, or why certain images are so appealing to you from things that you've seen on Pinterest or in gardening magazines. So trying to just kind of really hone down what it is that people are trying to achieve within that space.
Yeah, so you're taking their ideas and kind of underpinning them with design principles. So
yes,
yeah,
exactly,
yes.
exactly, yeah.
So I was thinking about, when I was drawing up the questions for you, I was thinking about the use of things like moss, in terrariums and in kokedama, and also really the sourcing of indoor plants. So obviously we are all trying to minimise our impact on the environment. So are there any materials that you might shy away from using, or are there ways that we can kind of ensure that we're not adding to any problems?
Yeah, I mean, the things that I notice mainly with my workshops and with planting myself, as I'm sure you do, with the gardens you work on, is the pots and the usage of pots. And there's some really good garden centres that have good sort of return or recycling schemes. Most sort of pots can be sort of recycled, apart from the black pots, I think. They can't really be recycled, but it's trying to work out uses for them as well. So I always try to reuse my pots if I can, give them a good wash with some soapy water, and they're great for sort of propagation, and that you can kind of always sort of try and reuse as much as possible. That's kind of what I aim to do. I've also stopped using any soil that if I do use it, I use soil that has a very low peat content. And I think that is sort of very important as far as when we're looking at the soil that we use going forward, to try and reduce peat wherever possible in our soil. So, yeah, it's trying to constantly think about the materials that we're using in gardens as well, and trying to be a lot more vigilant and focused on where those things are sourced or where they come from. It's really important, as you say. Yeah,
so not being wasteful as well, I think, is a big thing, isn't it? Not buying more than you need, or ending up kind of chucking stuff away.
Absolutely, yeah, wherever possible.
Thank you very much to Alyson for taking part in the interview, which she kindly squeezed in between multiple work and life commitments. If you'd like to check out her work, you can visit her website, alysonmowat.com, which is Alyson with a Y, and Mowat is Mowat. You'll find details of her design work and workshops there too. And you can also get a copy of her book, Terrariums and Kokedama, from the usual outlets, and of course I'll put a link to her website and book in the show notes. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday for an episode all about growing and eating flowers.